A cold wind sweeps over southern Germany. 30 B-17 bombers thunder through the clouds, their silver wings glinting above the smoke columns of a dying Reich. Beneath them, painted crimson at the tail, flies the 300th Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen. Their radios crackle with tense discipline. Bandits, 3 o'clock high. German Me-262 jet fighters, Hitler's last miracle weapons, dive in from the sun, streaking faster than anything the Americans have faced before. But the red tails don't flinch. Captain Roscoe Brown pulls his P-51 Mustang into a climb, cuts across the jet's path, and fires. One Me-262 explodes into fragments. In a single day, these African-American pilots will destroy 3 of Germany's most advanced aircraft. Far away in Berlin, the Luftwaffe's high command receives the report. The reaction is disbelief, followed by silence. Someone in the room mutters, "Negerpiloten? Black pilots." By nightfall, the news will reach Hitler himself, and what he does next reveals more than fury. It exposes the collapse of his entire myth. When the Second World War began in 1939, Adolf Hitler's Reich was built upon a single poisonous conviction: that entire races could be measured, ranked, and ruled. In the Nazi worldview, Aryans were destined to conquer. Others were born to serve or vanish. The propaganda machine ran on images of white perfection: the blonde soldier, the pure bloodline, the myth of German invincibility. Across the Atlantic, America was fighting its own contradictions. The U.S. Army, though preparing to battle fascism, was still segregated by law and practice. African Americans could serve, but not as equals. They were often relegated to supply units, maintenance, or menial roles. The idea of a black man flying a high-performance fighter plane seemed, to most military officials, unthinkable. In 1940, pressure from civil rights organizations and black newspapers forced President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration to confront that hypocrisy. The Army Air Corps, after years of resistance, announced an experiment, a segregated flying unit to train African-American pilots. The experiment would take place at a small, isolated base in Alabama, Tuskegee Army Airfield. Here, under the burning southern sun, hundreds of young black men gathered. They came from every corner of America: New York, Chicago, Kansas, the rural South. Many were college graduates. Others were mechanics or dreamers who had never been near an airplane. What united them was determination. They trained under constant scrutiny. White officers doubted them. Newspapers mocked them. Even the War Department feared failure would prove segregation right. Yet within months, something remarkable emerged: a program producing disciplined, fearless aviators. They learned to fly the PT-17 Stearman, the BT-13 Valiant, and the advanced AT-6 Texan. Every takeoff was a small act of rebellion against centuries of prejudice. The airfield became more than a training ground. It was a forge. Out of it came men like Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of the U.S. Army's first black general, whose leadership would later define the unit. By 1942, the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first of its kind, was activated. Its insignia, a red bird with outstretched wings, clutching lightning bolts. Its pilots were ready, but Washington hesitated. Many officers still doubted whether these men could handle combat stress. So, while white units went to Europe, the Tuskegee pilots waited. They studied aerial tactics, ran endless drills, and endured the sting of mockery from other airmen. The segregation was complete. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate everything. Yet word began to spread. These men were outperforming expectations. Their discipline was unmatched. They didn't complain, they flew. When the opportunity finally came, it was to North Africa, under General Eisenhower's command. Their mission: protect bombers from German fighters over Tunisia. It was not just a test of skill. It was a test of a nation's conscience. As the desert winds whipped across the airstrips and the smell of fuel filled the air, the Tuskegee Airmen prepared to meet an enemy who had already written them off. The same Nazi regime that considered them inferior would soon be forced to face an unbearable truth: that courage knows no color. The Tuskegee Airmen's baptism of fire came in June 1943 over the Mediterranean. The 99th Fighter Squadron had been attached to the 33rd Fighter Group, operating from rough airstrips in Tunisia and Sicily. Their aircraft, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, was fast, rugged, and unforgiving. Its shark-toothed nose became a symbol of aggression, but its weight and limited climb rate made dogfighting against agile German Messerschmitts perilous. The first missions were brutal. German pilots of JG-53 and JG-27, veterans of the Battle of Britain, cut through Allied formations with lethal precision. American commanders watched the results nervously, ready to call the experiment a failure. Yet the Tuskegee pilots refused to bend. Under the leadership of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., they tightened discipline, refined tactics, and adapted. Each mission ended with debriefings that were both technical and personal, not just how to fight the Luftwaffe, but how to silence every whisper of doubt back home. By late 1943, their accuracy and escort skills began turning heads. Over Pantelleria, they strafed enemy gun positions with calm precision. In Sicily, they escorted B-25 bombers and brought every one of them home. When bomber crews realized the red tails never abandoned them to chase glory kills, respect began to replace prejudice. Then came a decisive transfer. In early 1944, the 99th joined three newly formed squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, to create the 332nd Fighter Group. Stationed at Ramitelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast, they now flew the sleek silver P-51 Mustang. Its long range and speed made it the ultimate bomber escort weapon. The men painted the tails deep crimson so their identity would never be mistaken again. The missions grew longer and more dangerous. The red tails escorted heavy bombers deep into enemy territory. Vienna, Munich, Regensburg, even Berlin. Luftwaffe squadrons considered these flights prime targets. Yet time after time, German aces returned with empty gun cameras, unable to claim a single red tail kill. Allied bomber crews began requesting them by name. "Get us the red tails." Each victory carried double weight. Every downed German plane defied two regimes, one that denied their humanity, another that doubted their ability. When Davis led a column of Mustangs over the Alps toward the Danube Valley, his men were no longer fighting only for survival. They were rewriting history with every trigger pull. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe command began circulating reports about these unusually disciplined American squadrons with red markings. Some German pilots, unaware they were black, assumed the color meant elite. When intelligence finally identified the unit's composition, disbelief turned to anger. Nazi racial doctrine had no answer for this. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the War Department faced a dilemma. The experiment had succeeded beyond expectation. The press cautiously began reporting their accomplishments. The myth of racial inferiority, once official policy on both continents, was crumbling in the thin blue air above Europe. The stage was set. The Red Tails would soon meet Germany's most advanced aircraft, and the myth of Aryan superiority would face its final humiliation. To understand what made the Tuskegee Airmen exceptional, one must look beyond the dogfights. Their war began long before they ever saw a German aircraft. It began with the quiet humiliation of segregation. The separate barracks, the doubting glances, the whispered slurs that followed them even in uniform. Each man who climbed into a P-51 had already won a smaller war against the system that said he did not belong there. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. embodied that defiance. Graduating from West Point in 1936, he spent 4 years there without a single cadet speaking to him socially. Yet he graduated in the top fifth of his class. His stoic calm became the moral core of the 302nd. When white officers questioned the Red Tail's combat value, Davis simply said, "We will not be judged by words, but by results." Under him, discipline was absolute. There were no excuses, no swagger, no individual heroics. He drilled into his men a creed: never leave a bomber unguarded. While other units broke formation to chase kills, the Red Tails held the line. Their pride lay not in victory counts, but in protection. For the bomber crews, this made all the difference. In the freezing altitudes over Munich or Linz, with flak bursting like black blossoms around them, they looked out of their cockpit windows and saw the red-painted tails slicing through the sky. Steady, unshakable. It meant survival. A veteran of the 15th Air Force later said, "When we saw those red tails, we knew we were coming home." The airmen's success was as much psychological as tactical. The Nazi regime had built its war on myths of racial superiority. For a Luftwaffe pilot raised on propaganda posters showing caricatures of inferiority, to be outflown and outgunned by black Americans was unthinkable. Each encounter shattered layers of ideology. Inside the Reich, these reports reached intelligence desks and command centers. Analysts wrote notes filled with disbelief. The Negerflagger, Negro flyers, were real, disciplined, effective. For Hitler's machine, this was not just a military failure, it was an ideological wound. The very people he classified as subhuman were proving themselves the equal or superior of his chosen elite in the most unforgiving test of all, aerial combat. Meanwhile, the Tuskegee Airmen understood the symbolism of their actions. They knew their performance in Europe would echo across oceans and generations. Every bomb they guarded, every aircraft they saved, was a blow not only against fascism, but against the racism that fed it. Their letters home were filled with both pride and exhaustion. Many wrote of returning to an America that might still deny them dignity, even after they risked everything for it. Yet none faltered. The mission was larger than themselves. They represented proof, living, flying proof, that skill, honor, and courage were colorless virtues. By 1944, the Red Tails had developed an aura. Other pilots spoke of them with a mix of admiration and envy. Bomber crews celebrated them in mess halls. Even generals began taking note. But in Berlin, that same reputation stirred something darker: confusion, disbelief, and a quiet rage. The Reich could not publicly admit that black pilots were humiliating their elite squadrons. But the evidence kept arriving. In wrecked Messerschmitts, downed Focke-Wulfs, and bomber crews who swore the red-tailed angels never failed them. And as their reputation grew, so did the tension within the Luftwaffe's command. The idea that the Reich's racial hierarchy might crumble in the skies at the hands of those it despised was intolerable. It was only a matter of time before the truth reached the one man who could least bear it: Adolf Hitler. By 1944, the air war over Europe had entered a new, desperate phase. The Allies were hammering the Reich's industrial heartlands: oil plants in Ploiești, factories in Regensburg, rail yards in Munich. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, was exhausted. Its veteran aces had been thinned by attrition, fuel shortages bit deep. Yet its doctrine, built on speed, aggression, and racial arrogance, still insisted that German pilots were inherently superior. The Red Tails shattered that assumption. Their aircraft, the North American P-51 Mustang, was a machine designed for endurance. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that had saved Britain in the Spitfire, It could escort bombers all the way from Italy to Berlin and back. Its laminar flow wings gave it speed and range unmatched by the Bf-109 or FW-190. But hardware alone didn't win these duels. Discipline did. Tuskegee pilots flew in tight defensive formations, weaving between bomber groups in slow, deliberate arcs that made surprise attacks nearly impossible. They called it the weave. The Luftwaffe called it frustrating. When German squadrons tried to lure them into dogfights, the red tails refused to bite. Their mission was bomber protection, not individual glory. That tactical restraint infuriated their opponents and preserved lives. The Luftwaffe's own after-action reports from early 1945 noted a disturbing pattern. Red-tailed Mustangs maintain escort integrity even under heavy attack. Their cohesion suggests special training. Those reports were correct. The 332nd Fighter Group had become a model of aerial coordination. Under Colonel Davis, flight leaders practiced combat maneuvers for hours, then debriefed every detail. They studied German attack patterns, radio procedures, even the psychology of enemy pilots. One Tuskegee officer later said, "We didn't just fight Germans, we studied them." From the Luftwaffe's perspective, that study paid off painfully. Many German pilots initially dismissed the red-tailed aircraft as another American color marking. But once intelligence identified them as Negerflieger, disbelief turned into something closer to obsession. In one captured German diary, the pilot wrote, "They fly perfectly. They do not scatter. Even under attack, they stay with the bombers. This discipline, it is unnatural for such men." That sentence captured the heart of the Reich's denial. The Nazi worldview couldn't reconcile skill and blackness. Each mission the Tuskegee Airmen completed was a contradiction in motion, circling high above their ideology. Technologically, the Luftwaffe still had advantages, especially with the new Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. But even these machines couldn't guarantee victory. The Me-262s were fast, but they required long, exposed runways. The Red Tails learned to patrol those areas, catching the jets during takeoff and landing. The moments when speed meant nothing. In one such mission, Captain Roscoe Brown and Lieutenant Charles Brantley intercepted a group of Me-262s near Berlin. With calm precision, they used altitude and timing to force the jets into disadvantage. 3 were shot down that day. The first time in history, piston engine fighters had defeated jets in open combat. Word of those kills raced through both Allied and German command channels. To the U.S. brass, it confirmed what bomber crews already knew. The Red Tails were the best escorts in the war. To the Luftwaffe, it was humiliation on a scale words couldn't mask. Inside the German Air Ministry, reports began crossing Hitler's desk. At first, he dismissed them, calling them propaganda. When Göring insisted the losses were real, Hitler erupted in one of his infamous tirades. According to witnesses, he demanded to know how Negro pilots could defeat German jets. No one answered. In that moment, ideology had met reality and lost. The next phase of the war would only deepen that defeat. March 24, 1945. Operation Varsity. The largest airborne assault since D-Day. More than 1,600 Allied bombers and 2,300 fighters surged toward Germany's heartland to crush what remained of the Reich's defenses. Their target, oil refineries, railway junctions, and airfields feeding the Ruhr pocket. Escorting them from the south, rising from the Adriatic coast, were 57 P-51 Mustangs of the 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails. The morning air over the Danube shimmered with cold sunlight. Contrails painted long white scars across the sky. Radio chatter crackled. Red leader, Titan spread. Bandits inbound, 20+, high and right. German radar stations near Munich had already picked up the formation. The Reich was throwing everything it had left, including its last hope. The Me-262 jet fighters of Jagdgeschwader 7, they came fast. Faster than anything the Red Tails had faced. Silver streaks cutting down through the clouds at nearly 540 km/h. The roar of the twin-engine jets hit before they were even visible. Flak bursts filled the air like black flowers. Yet, the Red Tails didn't scatter. Captain Roscoe Brown banked his Mustang sharply, scanning for the sunlight glint of an approaching jet. "Keep your discipline," Davis's voice echoed over the channel. "Protect the bombers." The first Me-262 slashed through the formation, firing 30mm shells that tore through a B-17's wing. The bomber spiraled away, trailing smoke. Brown rolled over, cut throttle, then dove. Timing his descent perfectly, he caught the jet just as it pulled up from its attack. His guns chattered. 6 half-inch Brownings spitting flame. The jet exploded in a flash of orange and black, fragments tumbling through the haze. Within minutes, 2 more Me-262s were downed. Lieutenant Charles Brantley clipped one during landing approach. Another jet, attempting to outrun pursuit, was forced into evasive dives until it slammed into a field near Munich. The air battle lasted less than 15 minutes. When it ended, the Red Tails had destroyed 3 of Germany's most advanced aircraft without losing a single bomber. It was a staggering achievement, the first recorded instance of propeller-driven fighters defeating jets in combat. But for the men inside those cockpits, there was no celebration, only silence, sweat, and relief. The mission wasn't about kills, it was about keeping the bombers alive. And on that day, every bomber under Red Tail protection returned safely. A perfect escort record. That night, the reports moved up the chain. Enemy jets destroyed. Pilots. Brown. Brantley. Pruitt. Then to higher headquarters. Negro Fighter Group achieves significant victories over German jet aircraft. And finally, to Berlin. Inside the Reich Chancellery, the message was received by Luftwaffe staff officers under Hermann Göring. The word Negerflieger appeared in the report. It landed like an accusation. Göring, pale and exhausted, brought it to Hitler personally. The Führer was already furious at the Allied crossing of the Rhine. The news that black pilots had outflown his miracle jets was unbearable. Witnesses later described the outburst: Hitler pacing, shouting about betrayal, about decadent America arming savages. He accused Göring of weakness, threatened purges, demanded proof the reports were false. None came. The numbers didn't lie. The Luftwaffe's proud myth had been pierced, not just by technology or numbers, but by the very people his ideology had declared incapable of mastery. In that moment, the war entered its symbolic end. The Red Tails had done more than win a battle. They had exposed the hollowness of everything the Reich believed in. And Hitler's rage, though loud, was nothing compared to the silence spreading through his shattered command. The silence of disbelief. The spring of 1945 was not just the end of a war, it was the disintegration of a myth. For 6 years, Germany had ruled the skies of Europe with arrogance and precision. But by March, its airfields were cratered, its fuel nearly gone, its young pilots barely trained. Against that ruin stood the disciplined lines of the 392nd Fighter Group. Still flying, still escorting, still undefeated. Inside the shattered marble halls of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler raged daily. Intelligence briefings became rituals of blame. When the report of Negerflieger victories reached him, he dismissed it as Allied propaganda, until Göring's adjutant presented gun camera footage taken from wrecked Me-262s. The pilots who had escaped spoke with shame and disbelief. The red-tailed Mustangs had caught them during takeoff, shot them from the sky, and vanished before the jets could gain speed. Hitler reportedly threw the report across the room. He ranted about betrayal, about racial decay, about the degeneration of his master race. The men in the room, generals, secretaries, aides, said nothing. They had seen the truth written in smoke above their own cities. Meanwhile, at Ramatelli airfield in Italy, the Red Tails cleaned their planes in silence. They didn't yet know the full reaction in Berlin, nor did they care. Their focus remained professional. Davis ordered maintenance crews to inspect every gun barrel, every drop tank, every oil line. Tomorrow, another mission awaited. But among the bomber crews they escorted, the legend was spreading fast. "The Red Tails never lose one of ours," pilots said in the mess halls. The phrase became sacred, a promise whispered before each flight. By April, that reputation was statistically undeniable. The 332nd Fighter Group had escorted more than 200 bomber missions deep into enemy territory. Of the hundreds of bombers under their protection, not a single one was lost to enemy aircraft while they were on duty, a record unmatched by any other escort group in the war. Their kill tally exceeded 110 German planes, including Me-262 jets, FW-190s, and Bf-109s. Luftwaffe intelligence continued documenting the humiliation. In late April, a field report from Oberkommando der Luftwaffe noted, "Enemy-colored pilots display unusual persistence and unity in defense of bomber formations. Attacks upon them yield no success. Morale effect upon our pilots is negative." That single line, "morale effect negative," said everything. The Reich's last pilots were now afraid not of the bombers, but of the guardians with crimson tails. As Germany's cities fell and its skies emptied, the symbolism of those encounters grew unbearable for Nazi ideology. The same propaganda machine that once claimed to defend civilization from racial contamination now hid from the fact that its final battles were being lost to men it had called subhuman. In late April, while Hitler dictated his final delusional orders in his bunker, red-tail Mustangs were strafing German airfields near Linz and Neuburg. They destroyed hangars, fuel depots, and dozens of aircraft on the ground. The 332nd ended the war with one of the highest aerial victory-to-loss ratios in the entire 15th Air Force. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The Tuskegee Airmen's planes stood silent on the tarmac, their red paint dulled by dust and sunlight. The men gathered for a photo, smiles faint, eyes weary. Behind them, the war's smoke still rose over the Alps. They had done what history said they could not. They had flown through the storm, dismantled the myth of Aryan invincibility, and in doing so, struck the final blow not just against fascism, but against the idea that courage could ever be measured by color. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the Red Tails did not march in parades or bask in headlines. They packed their flight gear, logged their final missions, and waited for orders that never came. The war was over, but the battle for recognition was just beginning. The official combat record of the 332nd Fighter Group spoke louder than any speech. 578 combat missions flown, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, and 150 more on the ground. 66 pilots killed in action, men whose names would be remembered only within the unit for years. And perhaps the most extraordinary statistic of all, 0 bomber losses to enemy fighters under their escort, a feat unmatched in the Allied Air Forces. Those numbers were verified by the 15th Air Force in early 1946. For the bomber crews who had lived through flak storms and Messerschmitt attacks, they were not numbers, they were salvation. "The Red Tails brought us home," said one veteran of the 483rd Bomb Group. Every time. But in the segregated America they returned to. The Tuskegee Airmen found themselves stepping off victory planes into a divided nation. Restaurants refused them service. Transport depots separated them by race. Some officers were denied access to officers' clubs, even while wearing the uniform of men who had defeated Hitler's best. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. remained unflinching. His leadership had held the group together through years of hostility, and now it would sustain them through peacetime neglect. The only way to defeat prejudice, he said quietly, is performance. And performance? The Tuskegee Airmen had delivered in abundance. Within military circles, their reputation spread in whispers first, then reports. General Benjamin W. Chidlaw, commanding the U.S. Air Forces in Europe, Sididri Kanintortiden Dandiopunpointfours, described the 332nd as one of the most professional and reliable escort groups of the campaign. Even skeptical commanders acknowledged their value. In 1946, a classified War Department memorandum summarized their impact with uncharacteristic candor. The performance of colored fighter units in the European theater exceeded expectations and demonstrates full capability for integrated service. That sentence, understated as it was, marked the beginning of a transformation. The Tuskegee Airmen had done more than fight the Luftwaffe. They had proven that excellence ignored color, and that segregation had no basis in ability. Their success reverberated through the highest levels of government. When President Harry S. Truman reviewed post-war military reforms, the data from the 332nd became part of the evidence used to justify the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces in 1948 through Executive Order 9981. It was not a gift. It was earned in the thin air over Germany. For the men who had flown through those skies, the medals came slowly. Many received the Distinguished Flying Cross or the Air Medal. Decades later, they would be honored collectively with the Congressional Gold Medal. But in 1945, they returned home to quiet anonymity. At bases in Ohio, Alabama, and Illinois, they trained new pilots, helped rebuild peacetime aviation programs, and tried to reconcile pride with frustration. They had fought tyranny abroad and returned to inequality at home. Still, their record stood untouched. And in military archives across both continents, one truth remained written in ink and sky alike. The Red Tails never failed the bombers they swore to protect. History has a way of catching up, slowly, unevenly, but inevitably. In the years following World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen dispersed across America, carrying with them a quiet pride and a heavy truth, that heroism had not been enough to erase prejudice overnight. Yet the ripples of what they had done in Europe would keep spreading through generations of pilots, historians, and citizens who would one day look up and see their reflection in the Red Tails' courage. By the 1950s, the newly desegregated U.S. Air Force began to change its culture. Many of the Tuskegee veterans re-enlisted, now able to serve beside men who had once doubted them. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. continued to rise, from squadron commander to brigadier general, eventually becoming the first African-American general in the U.S. Air Force. His calm professionalism, the same stoicism that had carried him through the silence of West Point and the fire of the European skies, became legend within the service. Others found new missions. Daniel Chappie James, Jr., a Tuskegee trainee, became the first black four-star general in U.S. military history. Roscoe Brown earned a doctorate and devoted his life to education. Many became instructors, engineers, and mentors, teaching future aviators the same creed that had carried them through the war. Excellence is the answer. Meanwhile, historians began to re-examine the air war. Early post-war accounts had largely omitted the Red Tails, focusing instead on larger bomber groups or white fighter aces. But as archival data emerged, mission logs, gun camera footage, combat reports, the record became impossible to ignore. The myth that the Tuskegee Airmen were a political experiment evaporated. They were, simply and undeniably, among the best. In 1995, the U.S. Air Force officially confirmed their bomber protection record. 0 losses to enemy fighters while under Red Tail escort. The statement rewrote decades of underappreciation and cemented their reputation among the greatest fighter units of the war. Across the Atlantic, recognition grew too. German historians studying Luftwaffe archives found repeated references to red-tailed Mustangs in late war reports, always accompanied by words like disciplined, unyielding, and dangerous. One surviving Luftwaffe pilot, interviewed decades later, said simply, "We didn't know they were black. We only knew they were good. Very good." That line perhaps best encapsulated the final victory. The Red Tails had transcended every boundary their enemies, and even their allies, had drawn. They had proven in combat, the purest test of human ability, that skill, courage, and character know no color, no category, no limit. In 2007, more than 60 years after their first mission, surviving members of the Tuskegee Airmen stood together in Washington, D.C., as they received the Congressional Gold Medal. Many were old, their uniforms heavy with medals and memories. As the applause filled the chamber, the meaning of their long journey became clear. They had fought 2 wars, one against fascism, another against prejudice. And they had won both. Today, every red-painted tail on a modern aircraft restoration is more than a tribute. It is a reminder that discipline defeats hate, that dignity outlasts propaganda, and that even in history's darkest hours, truth can rise, higher than the clouds, faster than the lies that sought to bury it. The war ended long ago. The bombers have rusted, the runways are silent, and the voices that once filled the radios have faded into the wind. But above the clouds, where the sunlight turns metal to silver and silence to music, the legacy of the Red Tails still flies. History often remembers wars in numbers, sorties, kills, tonnage, losses. But the story of the Tuskegee Airmen was never about numbers. It was about belief. Belief in one's worth when the world insists otherwise. Every time they climbed into those Mustangs, they carried not just machine guns and fuel, but centuries of doubt placed on their shoulders. They rose through it, and they never fell. Their enemy believed in bloodlines. They believed in discipline. Their enemy worshipped race. They worshipped responsibility. And when those 2 faiths met above Europe, it was discipline that won, not hatred. For Hitler, the news that black pilots had outflown his Luftwaffe was more than a tactical loss. It was a philosophical collapse. His ideology had been defeated by the very people he deemed inferior. And in that defeat, the world glimpsed a deeper truth, that tyranny feeds on illusion, and courage dispels it. For America, their victory was a mirror. The Red Tails forced their own nation to confront the contradiction of fighting for freedom, while denying it to some of its bravest defenders. In time, that mirror would spark reform. Not instantly, but inevitably. Today, their story is taught in flight schools, told in documentaries, painted on the tails of commemorative aircraft. Each red tail that gleams under the sun carries a message written in the language of flight. Character is colorless. They didn't just escort bombers, they escorted a nation toward its better self.